My mother-in-law Cordelia took my grandmother's diamond necklace right off my neck at her own birthday party, claiming it was too extravagant for someone my age. I was stunned, but what happened next changed everything. When my millionaire father found out, he didn't just get angry. He bought her entire apartment building. By the time he was finished, Cordelia learned exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong family. Let me start from the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Moreau, and at 28, I thought I had my life figured out. I'm a pediatric nurse at Riverside General Hospital in the charming city of Bellhaven, nestled in the mountains of Northern California. It's not glamorous work, but it's meaningful, and the pay allows me to live comfortably in my small but cozy apartment downtown. My husband Marcus and I had been married for 3 years, and despite some family complications, life felt stable and good. The complications, of course, centered around Marcus's mother, Cordelia Blackthorne. Cordelia was what you might call old money from the prestigious Hillcrest district, the kind of woman who measured people's worth by their postal codes and bank statements. She lived in an elegant Victorian apartment building called Rosewood Manor, which had been in her family for generations. The building was her pride and joy, with its 12 luxury units housing Bellhaven's most distinguished residents. Cordelia occupied the penthouse suite and served as both owner and unofficial social coordinator for the building's elite tenants. When Marcus first brought me home to meet her 4 years ago, Cordelia's disapproval was immediate and barely concealed. I wasn't from the right family, didn't attend the right schools, and worst of all, I worked as a common nurse instead of pursuing what she considered more refined career. She never said these things directly, of course. Cordelia was far too sophisticated for such crude honesty. Instead, she delivered her judgment through carefully constructed comments and strategic social exclusions. "How interesting that you chose nursing," she'd say with a tight smile. "Such a practical profession. I suppose not everyone can pursue the arts or philanthropy." Marcus, bless him, tried to bridge the gap between us. He'd grown up under Cordelia's exacting standards and understood her language of subtle disapproval better than anyone. He constantly made excuses for her behavior, explaining that she just needed time to warm up to me, that her standards came from a place of caring about his future. "She means well, Bella," he'd say after particularly uncomfortable family dinners. "She just wants the best for me. For us. Give her time." But 3 years of marriage and countless awkward interactions had shown me that Cordelia's opinion of me hadn't softened. It had simply become more strategically concealed. The diamond necklace that would eventually become the center of this entire story was my most treasured possession. It had belonged to my grandmother, Isabella Moreau, a woman of extraordinary grace and strength who had raised me after my parents' messy divorce when I was 12. The necklace was an exquisite Art Deco piece from the 1920s. A delicate platinum chain supporting a stunning 2-carat diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires in an intricate geometric pattern. Grandmama Elena had been quite wealthy in her own right, though she lived modestly and never flaunted her resources. The necklace was one of the few luxury items she'd kept from her younger days, and she'd always promised it would be mine someday. When she passed away 2 years ago, I'd inherited not just the necklace, but also a substantial trust fund that I'd kept quiet about. Grandmama had always taught me that real wealth was displayed through generosity and character, not flashy spending. I wore the necklace sparingly, only on special occasions, both because of its sentimental value and because it was genuinely valuable, appraised at over $40,000. But when Cordelia announced she was throwing herself an elaborate 60th birthday party at the exclusive Belmont Country Club, I decided it was an appropriate time to wear Grandmama's necklace. It was beautiful, elegant, and I thought it might even earn me a small measure of respect from Cordelia's social circle. How naive I was. The party itself was exactly what you'd expect from Cordelia, impeccably planned, expensively executed, and designed to showcase her social standing. The Belmont Country Club's grand ballroom was decorated with white orchids and gold accents, while a string quartet provided tasteful background music. Bellhaven's elite had turned out in force: city council members, successful business owners, prominent doctors and lawyers, all dressed in their finest and most conservative attire. I'd chosen a navy blue cocktail dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing, paired with modest heels and minimal makeup. The diamond necklace was the only dramatic element of my outfit, and I'd received several genuine compliments throughout the evening. Even Marcus seemed proud to have me on his arm for once at one of his mother's social functions. "You look beautiful tonight," he'd whispered as we posed for photos near the elaborate birthday cake. "And I love seeing you wear Grandmama Elena's necklace. She would have been so proud." For a few hours I actually believed the evening might pass without incident. Cordelia had been polite if not warm when greeting me. She'd introduced me to several of her friends as Marcus's wife Isabella, the nurse, which was progress from her usual reluctance to acknowledge my existence at all. I began to think that maybe, finally, we might be finding some common ground. I should have known better. The incident happened during the gift opening ceremony, when Cordelia was holding court in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by beautifully wrapped packages and an audience of admirers. She was in her element, graciously accepting expensive presents and making charming remarks about each one. I was standing with Marcus and several other family members, applauding politely and trying to look engaged. That's when Cordelia's gaze fell on my necklace. I noticed her staring, but at first I thought she might be admiring it. Perhaps she was finally recognizing that I had some taste, some sense of appropriate elegance. But then her expression shifted, and I saw something I'd never seen before in her carefully controlled features, raw, undisguised hunger. "Isabella, dear," she called out, her voice cutting through the ambient conversation. "Come here for a moment." The room's attention turned to me as I reluctantly approached. Cordelia's smile was brilliant and predatory, like a cat that had just spotted a particularly appealing mouse. "What a lovely necklace you're wearing," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now quiet ballroom. "It's quite striking. Wherever did you get such a piece?" I felt heat rising in my cheeks as every eye in the room focused on my jewelry. "It was my grandmother's," I replied quietly, hoping to end the attention quickly. "How wonderful that you have such a family heirloom," Cordelia continued, stepping closer. "Though I have to say, darling, it seems a bit mature for someone your age. Such elaborate pieces are really more appropriate for women of greater experience in standing." The insult was delivered with such practiced skill that it took me a moment to fully process what she'd said. Around us I could hear murmurs from the guests, some sympathetic, others amused by the social theater playing out before them. Before I could respond, Cordelia reached out and actually touched the necklace, her fingers tracing the diamond setting. "It really is exquisite craftsmanship," she said thoughtfully, "the kind of piece that deserves to be worn by someone who truly understands its significance." And then, to my absolute shock and the gasps of everyone watching, Cordelia reached behind my neck and began unfastening the clasp. "What are you doing?" I managed to whisper, but she'd already removed the necklace. "Happy birthday to me," she announced to the room, holding up the necklace as if it were a trophy. "What a thoughtful gift from my dear daughter-in-law. How generous of you to give me something so meaningful." The ballroom erupted in confused murmurs. Several guests applauded uncertainly, not sure if they were witnessing a planned surprise or something else entirely. Marcus stood frozen beside me, his face pale with shock. "Cordelia," he started, but she cut him off with a brilliant smile. "Wasn't that thoughtful of Isabella to surprise me like this, and on my birthday no less? Though I suppose it's only fitting after all. A necklace of this caliber belongs with someone who has the social position to truly appreciate." I stood there, humiliated and speechless, as Cordelia fastened my grandmother's necklace around her own neck. The theft had been so smoothly executed, so publicly performed, that objecting would have made me look ungrateful and petty. She had outmaneuvered me completely. But what Cordelia didn't know was that my father, Vincent Moreau, wasn't just any ordinary man. He was one of the most successful real estate developers on the West Coast, with a net worth that dwarfed even Cordelia's old money pretension. And when he found out what had happened to his beloved daughter, and to his late mother's precious necklace, he was going to show Cordelia exactly why you should never underestimate quiet money. The war was about to begin, and Cordelia had no idea what was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ride home from Cordelia's birthday party was suffocating. Marcus gripped the steering wheel of his sedan with white knuckles. His jaw clenched as we navigated the winding roads back to downtown Bellhaven. The silence between us felt dense and toxic, filled with all the things neither of us knew how to say. I sat in the passenger seat, my hand unconsciously reaching for the necklace that was no longer there. Each time my fingers found empty air where Grandmama Elena's diamonds should have been, a fresh wave of humiliation washed over me. The theft had been so public, so deliberately orchestrated, that I still couldn't quite believe it had actually happened. "She'll give it back," Marcus finally said, his voice tight with forced optimism. "Tomorrow when she's had time to think about it." Mother theatrical sometimes at parties, she likes to be the center of attention, but she's not actually cruel. I turned to stare at him, wondering if he truly believed what he was saying, or if denial was just easier than confronting the reality of who his mother really was. "Theatric," I repeated quietly. "Marcus, she stole my grandmother's necklace, in front of 50 people, she called it a birthday gift." "She didn't steal it," he said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "She was just making a point about something. Maybe she felt left out, or thought we should have brought her a proper gift to begin with." The rationalization was so absurd that I almost laughed. Instead, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not just anger, but a crystalline clarity about exactly where I stood in this family hierarchy. "So it's my fault for not bringing an expensive enough gift." "That's not what I meant." Marcus pulled into our apartment complex parking lot and killed the engine. In the sudden quiet, I could hear his breathing, shallow and stressed. "Look, I'll talk to her tomorrow. I'll explain that the necklace has sentimental value, that it belonged to your grandmother. She'll understand." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. 3 years of marriage had taught me to read Marcus's expressions, and right now he looked like a man trying to convince himself of something he didn't quite believe. We climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment in silence. Our home was modest but comfortable, a 2-bedroom unit with hardwood floors and large windows that looked out over Bellhaven's historic district. It was nothing like the grandeur of Rosewood Manor, but it was ours, and until tonight, it had felt like a sanctuary. Now it felt like a refuge for the defeated. I went straight to our bedroom and began removing my jewelry, what little remained of it. My simple pearl earrings, a wedding gift from Marcus, went into their designated spot in my jewelry box. My wedding ring stayed on, but even that felt different somehow, tainted by the evening's events, and Marcus's weak response to his mother's cruelty. "Bella," Marcus said from the doorway, "we need to talk about this, do we?" I slipped out of my dress and hung it carefully in the closet. "What exactly is there to talk about? Your mother humiliated me in front of her entire social circle, stole a priceless family heirloom, and you're making excuses for her. Seems pretty clear to me. She's family," he said, as if that explained everything. "Complicated family, but family nonetheless. You know how she is. She needs to feel important, respected. Maybe if we'd made more of an effort over the years." I spun around to face him, incredulous. "More of an effort?" "Marcus, I have bent over backwards trying to win that woman's approval for 3 years. I've attended every family dinner, smiled through every snide comment, dressed appropriately for every social function. What more effort could I have possibly made?" "I know you've tried," he said, sitting heavily on the edge of our bed, "but maybe there's something we're missing, some way to reach her that we haven't thought of." The conversation continued in circles for another 20 minutes, with Marcus desperately trying to find explanations that would make his mother's behavior acceptable, and me growing increasingly frustrated with his refusal to simply acknowledge what had happened. Finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, I told him I needed space to think. Marcus retreated to the living room, and I heard the television turn on, his usual method of avoiding difficult conversation. I sat on our bed, staring at my reflection in the dresser mirror, and tried to process the full scope of what Cordelia had done. It wasn't just about the necklace, though that hurt deeply. It was about power, about putting me in my place, about demonstrating to her social circle that I would always be beneath her station. She had humiliated me publicly and then made it impossible for me to object without looking petty and ungrateful. The worst part was that it had worked perfectly. I was reaching for my phone to call my best friend Sarah when it rang in my hand. The caller ID showed a name that made my heart skip. Vincent Moreau. My father. Dad rarely called this late, unless something was wrong. His real estate empire kept him busy with projects from San Francisco to Seattle, and he was usually asleep by 10:30. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. "Hi, Dad," I answered, trying to keep the strain out of my voice. "Isabella." His voice was warm but concerned. "I hope I'm not calling too late. I just got off a conference call with investors in Tokyo and I've been thinking about you all evening. How was Cordelia's birthday party?" The simple question broke something inside me. All the composure I'd been fighting to maintain crumbled and suddenly I was crying. Not the dignified tears of earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and hurt. "Sweetheart." Dad's voice immediately shifted to the gentle tone I remembered from childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. "What happened?" Through halting, tear-choked words I told him everything. The party, the public humiliation, Cordelia's calculated theft of Grandmama Elena's necklace, Marcus's weak response, and my own powerlessness in the face of such sophisticated cruelty. Dad listened without interrupting, though I could hear his breathing grow deeper and more controlled as the story progressed. When I finally finished, the silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "Dad, are you still there?" "I'm here." His voice had changed completely. Gone was the warm, comforting father tone, replaced by something I'd rarely heard before, cold, calculating, and absolutely furious. "Isabella, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you listening?" "Yes." What Cordelia did tonight was not a family squabble or a social misunderstanding. It was a deliberate assault on you, on our family, on your grandmother's memory. Do you understand that? Yes, I think so. No, I need you to be completely clear about this. Dad's voice carried an authority I'd forgotten he possessed. The voice of a man who'd built a business empire from nothing and crushed every competitor who'd tried to stop him. Cordelia Blackthorne just declared war on the wrong family. She has no idea who she's dealing with, but she's about to find out. A chill ran down my spine. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about consequences, sweetheart. Real consequences for real action." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler but no less determined. "Your grandmother Elena was the strongest woman I ever knew, and that necklace represented everything she valued: dignity, family, and the importance of standing up for what's right. No one steals from Elena Moreau's granddaughter and walks away unscathed. But Dad, she's Marcus's mother. This is complicated." "No, Isabella, it's actually very simple." I could hear papers rustling in the background, and I realized he was already working, already planning some. "Cordelia thinks she understands power because she has old money and social position, but she's about to learn the difference between inherited wealth and earned power, between playing social games and real consequences. I'm going to remind Cordelia Blackthorne that there are bigger fish in the ocean than she can imagine, and then I'm going to get your grandmother's necklace back." The certainty in his voice was both comforting and terrifying. "Dad, please don't do anything that will make things worse. I still have to live in this town, still have to deal with her as family." "Sweetheart," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, though it wasn't a pleasant one. "By the time I'm finished, Cordelia is going to be begging to give you that necklace back, and she's going to understand exactly why my mother chose to live quietly instead of flashing her wealth around." "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time for the Blackthorne family to learn who they've really been dealing with all these years. Cordelia thinks she knows about old money and social position. Tomorrow, she's going to discover what new money with unlimited resources can accomplish when it's properly motivated." Before I could ask what he meant, Dad's tone shifted back to loving and paternal. "Get some sleep, sweetheart. Tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day. And Isabella, yes? Don't worry about Marcus or his reaction to what's coming. If he can't stand up for his wife when his mother publicly humiliates her, then he needs to learn some lessons too. Family loyalty runs both ways." After he hung up, I sat staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of a single conversation, everything had changed. I was no longer just the humiliated daughter-in-law nursing her wounds. I was about to become the center of something much larger and more consequential. For the first time since leaving the party, I smiled. Cordelia Blackthorne had no idea what was coming. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight streamed through our bedroom windows, birds chirped in the oak tree outside, and the coffee maker gurgled to life on its automatic timer. For a brief, disorienting moment, I almost forgot about the previous night's catastrophe. Then I reached instinctively for my necklace and found only bare skin. Marcus had already left for his job at Bellhaven First National Bank, leaving behind a hastily scrawled note, promising to handle everything with his mother today. His coffee mug sat abandoned in the sink, still half full, a sure sign of his anxiety. In 3 years of marriage, I'd never known Marcus to leave coffee unfinished. I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe twice in my entire nursing career. The charge nurse, Patricia, immediately knew something was seriously wrong. "Honey, you sound terrible," she said with the maternal concern that made her beloved by every pediatric patient. "Take care of yourself. We'll manage the floor today." I spent the morning in a strange limbo, unable to concentrate on anything but feeling like I should be doing something. Every few minutes, I found myself checking my phone for messages from Marcus or my father, but the device remained stubbornly silent. By noon, the waiting had become unbearable. That's when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and delivery drivers usually just left packages by the door. Cautiously, I peered through the peephole and saw a woman I didn't recognize, tall, professionally dressed, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant sheen. She carried a leather portfolio and had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting results. "Isabella Moreau?" she asked when I opened the door. "Yes, my name is Margaret Chen. I'm an attorney with Pinnacle Legal Services in San Francisco. Your father asked me to speak with you regarding a matter of some urgency." I stared at her, processing the implications. Dad had sent a lawyer who had driven 2 hours from San Francisco to my apartment on less than 12 hours' notice. Please, come in." Margaret followed me into the living room, declining my offer of coffee with polite efficiency. She settled onto our modest sofa with the kind of graceful authority that suggested she was equally comfortable in courtrooms and boardrooms. "Your father briefed me on last night's incident," she began without preamble, opening her portfolio. "The theft of your grandmother's necklace under the guise of a birthday gift, quite an audacious piece of social manipulation. Cordelia Blackthorne is clearly more cunning than she appears." "You know about Cordelia?" Margaret's smile was sharp and knowing. "I know quite a lot about Mrs. Blackthorne actually. When Vincent Moreau calls at midnight requesting a complete background analysis on someone, my firm drops everything else. We've been researching the Blackthorne family since 3 a.m. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on my coffee table. "Would you like to know what we discovered?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was prepared for the answer. "Cordelia Blackthorne's family wealth is largely illusory," Margaret began, her tone clinical and precise. "The Blackthorne fortune peaked in the 1960s under her father's management, but poor investment decisions and extravagant spending have eroded most of the actual assets. What remains is primarily real estate, specifically Rosewood Manor and 2 smaller properties in the Hillcrest district." This was news to me. Marcus had always spoken of his family's wealth as established and substantial, but she lives like she has unlimited resources. Appearances can be deceiving, particularly when someone is highly motivated to maintain them. Margaret flipped through several pages of financial documents. "Cordelia's annual income is approximately $200,000, which sounds substantial until you realize it comes almost entirely from rental properties that are heavily mortgaged. Her personal liquid assets are modest." I stared at the documents, trying to reconcile this information with the woman who had stolen my necklace with such supreme confidence. "She acts like she owns half of Bellhaven. Social positioning and actual financial power are often inversely related," Margaret observed. "People with real wealth rarely feel the need to prove it constantly. Mrs. Blackthorne's behavior suggests someone who feels her position is threatened." "Threatened by what?" Margaret's expression grew serious. "By you, potentially. Your marriage to Marcus represented a deviation from her carefully controlled social narrative. Your nursing career, your modest background, your grandmother's jewelry. These things don't fit the image she's constructed of her family's status. The analysis was devastating in its clarity. I'd spent 3 years believing I wasn't good enough for the Blackthorne family, never realizing that Cordelia might be equally insecure about her own position. But that's not why I'm here, Margaret continued. I'm here because your father has asked me to recover your property and ensure this situation is resolved permanently. How? Margaret pulled out a legal document that looked official and intimidating. This is a demand letter for the immediate return of stolen property. The necklace was appraised last year for insurance purposes at $43,000, making its theft a felony under California law. Mrs. Blackthorne has 24 hours to return it, or we file criminal charges. My stomach dropped. Criminal charges? That seems extra. Theft is theft, regardless of the social circumstances surrounding it, Margaret said firmly. Your grandmother's necklace was taken without permission under false pretenses. The fact that it happened at a party doesn't make it legal. But what about Marcus? His relationship with his mother? Margaret's expression softened slightly. Isabella, may I speak frankly? I nodded. Your husband's failure to protect you last night, his immediate attempts to excuse his mother's behavior, and his promise to handle everything today, suggest someone who prioritizes family peace over family justice. That's his choice, but it shouldn't determine your. The words stung because they rang so completely true. Marcus had positioned himself as a mediator rather than an advocate, treating the theft of my most precious possession as a family squabble, rather than a serious violation. Your father, however, takes a different view, Margaret continued. Vincent Moreau didn't build a real estate empire by accepting other people's definitions of what's reasonable or appropriate. When someone targets his family, he responds with overwhelming force. What kind of force? Margaret closed the folder and fixed me with a steady gaze. Are you familiar with Cordelia's financial situation regarding Rosewood Manor? Not really. Marcus mentioned it's been in the family for generations. It has been, but ownership structures evolve over time. The building itself is owned by Blackthorne Properties LLC, which is 90% controlled by Cordelia and 10% by Marcus. However, the underlying land is held under a separate entity, and the building carries substantial debt. I was beginning to see where this was going, and it made me feel slightly sick. My father is going to buy the building. Not exactly. Margaret's smile was predatory. Vincent already owns the land. Has for about 6 years, though the transaction was structured through enough shell companies that the Blackthornes never realized who the actual buyer was. The room seemed to tilt around me. What? Your father has been quietly acquiring properties throughout Bellhaven for nearly a decade. Strategic investments, he calls them. The land under Rosewood Manor became available when the previous owner, an elderly gentleman with no heirs, decided to sell. Vincent's offer was simply the highest. I stared at her, trying to process the implication. So he's been Cordelia's landlord for 6 years. Landlord, creditor, and as of this morning, majority stakeholder in Blackthorne Properties LLC. Margaret pulled out another document. Cordelia took out a significant loan against the building 2 years ago to maintain her lifestyle. The note came due last month, and when she couldn't make the payment, the lending institution, which happens to be one of Vincent's companies, exercised its option to convert the debt to equity. My father hadn't just been planning his response since last night. He'd been positioning himself for exactly this kind of situation for years, probably without even knowing it would be necessary. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Margaret continued, Vincent Moreau controls 68% of Blackthorne Properties LLC, owns the land underneath the building outright, and holds the mortgage on Cordelia's personal residence. He is, for all practical purposes, her landlord, her bank, and her business partner. The scope of it was breathtaking and terrifying. She has no idea, does she? None whatsoever. The paperwork is being delivered to her attorney as we speak, along with the demand letter for your necklace's return. Margaret checked her watch. An elegant Cartier that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I estimate she'll receive both documents within the next hour. And then what happens? Then Cordelia Blackthorne learns what happens when someone steals from Vincent Moreau's family. Margaret began packing her documents back into the portfolio. Your father asked me to assure you that the necklace will be returned by end of business today, and that Miss Blackthorne will never again feel comfortable treating you with anything less than complete respect. What if she refuses? What if she tries to fight this? Margaret's laugh was genuinely amused. Isabella, your father is worth approximately $200 million. He controls real estate holdings across 7 states and has business relationships that span 3 continents. Cordelia Blackthorne's entire net worth wouldn't cover his monthly operational expenses. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. There is one thing you should prepare for, however. What's that? Marcus is going to be very upset when he learns what's happening. Men often struggle when they realize their wives have access to more power than they do. You may need to decide which relationship is more important to you, your marriage or your family's willingness to protect you. After Margaret left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the business card she'd given me. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but pregnant with potential. Somewhere across town, Cordelia was about to receive the shock of her life. Somewhere else, Marcus was probably still trying to convince his mother to return my necklace through gentle persuasion and family loyalty. Neither of them understood what was really happening. For the first time since the party, I felt something other than humiliation and anger. I felt anticipation. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Chess, not checkers, sweetheart. Always chess. I smiled, finally understanding what Grandmama Elena used to mean when she said that quiet money was the most dangerous kind. The call from Marcus came at 2:47 p.m., just as I was attempting to distract myself with a mindless television show. His voice was strained, almost unrecognizable with panic. Bella, I need you to tell me exactly what you said to your father last night. I muted the television, my heart rate immediately spiking. What do you— I mean, my mother is sitting in her lawyer's office right now, completely hysterical, claiming that some attorney showed up with papers saying she doesn't own her own building anymore. She thinks you're behind it somehow. The accusation stung even though I'd been expecting something like this. Marcus, I told my father what happened at the party. That's all. That's all. His voice cracked with disbelief. Bella, there are lawyers involved now. Real lawyers with real legal papers. My mother is talking about losing everything, about having to move out of Rosewood Manor. This isn't just about a necklace anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to channel the calm authority I'd witnessed in Margaret Chen earlier. Maybe it was never just about the necklace. What is that supposed to mean? It means your mother made a choice last night, Marcus. She chose to humiliate me publicly and steal something that belonged to my grandmother. Actions have consequences. But lawyers, Bella, legal action against my family. This is insane. Can't you call your father and tell him to back off? Tell him it was a misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding hit me like a physical blow. After everything that had happened, after Margaret's revelations about Cordelia's calculated social manipulations, Marcus was still trying to minimize what his mother had done. It wasn't a misunderstanding, I said quietly. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing when she took my necklace, and apparently she's been playing financial games that are finally catching up with her. Financial games? What are you talking about? I realized Marcus genuinely had no idea about his family's actual financial situation. In his mind, the Blackthorne wealth was still solid and substantial, not the carefully maintained illusion that Margaret had described. Marcus, when was the last time you actually looked at your mother's finances? Really looked at them? That's not— Why would I need to look at her finances? She's always been fine. Has she, or has she just been very good at appearing fine? The silence stretched between us, filled with all the uncomfortable truths neither of us had wanted to acknowledge. Marcus had grown up accepting his mother's version of reality without question, and now that version was crumbling. I need to see you, he said finally. Can you come to the bank? I'm taking the afternoon off to deal with this. I don't think that's a good idea right now. Bella, please. We need to figure this out together. You're my wife. We're supposed to be a team. The irony of him talking about being a team now after 3 years of failing to stand up for me against his mother's constant slights was almost overwhelming. But I could hear genuine desperation in his voice, and despite everything, I still loved him. Fine, I'll come to the bank. But Marcus? Yeah, I'm not calling my father to back off. Whatever is happening right now, your mother brought it on herself. Bellhaven First National occupied a stately brick building in the heart of downtown, one of those institutions that projected stability and permanence through architectural gravitas alone. Marcus met me in the lobby, looking haggard and older than his 31 years. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, askew, hair mussed from running his hands through it, eyes red-rimmed with stress. "Thank God you're here," he said, pulling me into a desperate hug. "Everything is falling apart, and I don't understand any of it." He led me to his office, a modest space with a view of Bellhaven's main street. Banking regulations meant he couldn't hold a senior position due to his age and experience, but he'd worked hard to build a respectable career in commercial lending. It was steady, honorable work that provided a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, though nothing approaching the luxury his mother projected. "Tell me exactly what happened today," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Marcus collapsed into his own chair and began recounting the morning's events. He'd arrived at Rosewood Manor around 10 a.m., planning to have a gentle conversation with Cordelia about returning the necklace. Instead, he'd found her in a state of panic, surrounded by legal documents she couldn't understand. "She kept saying someone was trying to steal her building," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "At first I thought she was being dramatic, you know how she gets. But then her lawyer called and everything changed." According to Marcus, Cordelia's attorney, a local practitioner named Hamilton Webb, who specialized in estate planning and real estate, had been completely blindsided by the documents delivered that morning. The legal papers were technically complex and involved multiple corporate entities, but the bottom line was devastatingly simple. Cordelia no longer controlled her own property. Webb said he'd never seen anything like it. Marcus continued. He called it a perfectly legal acquisition that had been years in the making. He kept asking Mother about previous financial decisions, loans she'd taken, agreements she'd signed. She couldn't answer half his question. I felt a pang of sympathy for Marcus, watching his understanding of his family's situation crumble in real time, but I also felt a growing clarity about what this all meant. "Marcus, your mother took out a loan against the building 2 years ago. Did you know about that?" He looked at me sharply. "How do you know about that?" "Because the lawyer who came to see me today explained everything. The loan came due last month, and when your mother couldn't pay it back, the lender exercised their right to convert the debt to equity. That lender happens to be one of my father's companies." Marcus stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. "Your father's companies, Bella? Your dad develops strip malls and residential subdivisions. What would he want with Mother's building?" The disconnect was so profound that I almost laughed. Marcus had never really understood my father's business, partly because Dad had always been modest about his success, and partly because Marcus had never been particularly interested in learning about it. "My father doesn't just develop strip malls, Marcus. He's built one of the largest real estate empires on the West Coast. He owns properties from San Diego to Portland, including some of the most valuable commercial real estate in California." "That's impossible. If your father was that wealthy, why do you work as a nurse? Why do we live in a 2-bedroom apartment?" The questions revealed so much about Marcus's worldview, his assumption that wealth automatically meant ostentation, that rich people's children didn't work regular jobs. He'd never understood that my family's approach to money was fundamentally different from his mother's, because my father raised me to believe that work gives life meaning, regardless of financial necessity. Because my grandmother taught me that real class comes from contributing something valuable to the world, not from displaying expensive possessions. I could see Marcus struggling to reconcile this information with everything he thought he knew about our family's relative position. In his mind, he'd married beneath his station, a middle-class nurse, whose father did modest real estate development. The idea that my family might actually be significantly wealthier than his was fundamentally incompatible with his understanding of the world. "But if your father is so successful, why didn't he ever what? Never put your mother in her place before now? Never demonstrated that he could afford to buy and sell everything she owns 10 times over?" Marcus winced at my tone, but I was past caring about his sensitivities, because he didn't need to. "Marcus, because he was confident enough in his actual position that he didn't feel threatened by your mother's social posture, because he raised me to judge people by their character, not their bank accounts." "Then why is he doing this now?" The question hung in the air between us, forcing me to confront the real issue at the heart of everything that had happened. Because last night, your mother crossed a line. She didn't just insult me or make me feel unwelcome, she actually stole from me. She took something that belonged to my grandmother, something irreplaceable and precious, and she did it in the most humiliating way possible. I leaned forward, willing Marcus to understand the gravity of what his mother had done, and then when I came home devastated and crying, my husband spent the entire evening making excuses for her behavior instead of standing up for his wife. So when my father called and heard what had happened, he decided it was time to remind the Blackthorne family who they were really dealing with. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the quiet street below. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. So what happens now? Now your mother learns that actions have consequences. Now she discovers what it feels like to be powerless in someone else's game. And us, what happens to us? It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong in our marriage. Marcus wasn't asking about our relationship's future out of love or concern for my well-being. He was asking because he was finally beginning to understand the real power dynamics at play, and he was terrified of ending up on the wrong side of them. I don't know, Mark. That depends on whether you can figure out how to be my husband, instead of your mother's son. Before he could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Hamilton Webb, Cordelia's attorney. Marcus answered with shaking hands. Miss Blackthorne. Webb's voice was audible even though the phone wasn't on speaker. I need you to come back to my office immediately. We've received an additional communication that changes everything, and Mr. Blackthorne, you should probably bring your wife. The law offices of Webb and Associates occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building on Bellhaven's main thoroughfare, the kind of establishment that projected old-fashioned reliability through dark wood paneling and leather-bound legal volume. Hamilton Webb himself appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of someone who'd spent decades handling the genteel legal matters of Bellhaven's established families. Today, however, he looked like a man who'd been hit by a freight train. Mrs. Blackthorne, he said as we entered his office, gesturing toward Cordelia who sat rigidly in a wingback chair. Mr. and Mrs. Blackthorne, he added, acknowledging Marcus and me with a nod that suggested he understood the delicate family dynamics at play. Cordelia looked nothing like the commanding social presence who had stolen my necklace less than 24 hours earlier. Her usual perfect composure had cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched a tissue, and her carefully styled hair showed signs of anxious finger combing. Isabella, she said without looking at me directly, I suppose you're quite pleased with yourself. The accusation was delivered without her usual venom, more exhausted than angry. I chose not to respond, instead taking the seat Marcus indicated beside him, facing Webb's imposing mahogany desk. The situation has become considerably more complex, Webb began without preamble, consulting a stack of documents that seemed to have grown since our arrival. This morning's revelations regarding the ownership structure of Rosewood Manor were just the beginning. He turned to address me directly. Mrs. Blackthorne, the younger Mrs. Blackthorne, your father's legal team has been remarkably thorough. The documentation they've provided reveals a web of interconnected business relationships that span several years and multiple properties. Webb pulled out a detailed chart that looked like something from a corporate merger presentation. Vincent Moreau doesn't just own the land under Rosewood Manor. Through various corporate entities, he holds significant financial interests in approximately 60% of the commercial properties in Bellhaven's Hillcrest district. Marcus leaned forward, studying the chart with banker's eyes. How is that possible? Real estate transactions of that magnitude would have been noticed, talked about. The local business community isn't that large. That's precisely the point, Webb replied. Ms. Moreau's acquisitions were structured through multiple shell companies and investment trusts, often purchasing properties from distressed sellers or elderly owners looking to liquidate assets quietly. No single transaction was large enough to attract attention, but collectively, they represent a systematic acquisition of strategic real estate throughout your mother's immediate neighborhood. I found myself studying the chart with growing amazement. My father hadn't just been making smart investments, he'd been quietly assembling a real estate empire that included virtually everything surrounding Cordelia's sphere of influence. But why? Cordelia asked, speaking for the first time since our arrival. What could Vincent Moreau possibly want with properties in Bellhaven? His business interests are in San Francisco, Los Angeles, major metropolitan areas. Webb glanced at me before responding. According to the documentation provided by his legal team, Ms. Moreau's initial investments in Bellhaven were motivated by personal considerations, specifically, his daughter's decision to settle here after her marriage. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. My father had been quietly buying up properties in Bellhaven, not as random investments, but because this was where I lived. He'd been creating a safety net around my life without me ever knowing it. You're saying he bought all this real estate because of Isabella? Marcus asked, his voice tight with disbelief. It appears that way, Webb confirmed. The timeline of acquisitions correlates directly with significant events in your marriage. The first property purchase occurred 3 months after your wedding. The most recent was last year, coinciding with. He consulted his notes, then looked at me with something approaching sympathy. Coinciding with what appears to have been a particularly difficult period in your relationship with Mrs. Blackthorne Sr. I remembered last year a series of especially cruel social slights from Cordelia, culminating in her accidentally excluding me from a family Christmas card that was sent to hundreds of people. I'd cried about it to my father during one of our monthly phone calls, though I'd tried to minimize the hurt. Apparently Dad had been paying closer attention than I'd realized. This is insane, Cordelia said, her voice rising toward hysteria. He's been stalking our family, manipulating our business relationships, positioning himself to destroy us. This has to be illegal somehow. Webb's expression was carefully neutral. Mrs. Blackthorne, I've reviewed all the documentation with my most experienced associates. Every transaction appears to have been conducted legally and ethically. Mr. Moreau's companies offered fair market value for properties that were legitimately for sale. There's no evidence of coercion, fraud, or any other actionable misconduct. But surely there's something we can do, Marcus interjected. Some way to challenge this. To protect our family's interests. Webb was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how to deliver unwelcome news to longtime clients. That brings me to the second communication we received this afternoon. He pulled out an official-looking document with multiple signatures and seal. This is a formal business proposal from Moreau Development Corporation. They're offering to purchase Mrs. Blackthorne's remaining interest in Rosewood Manor for significantly above market value. How much? Cordelia asked, though she looked like she didn't want to hear the answer. $2.8 million. Cash. Closing within 30 days. The figure was staggering. Even I had no idea my father operated at that level of liquidity. Marcus looked like someone had hit him with a baseball bat. But that's... He started, then stopped, unable to finish the thought. That's more than the entire building is worth, Webb confirmed. Mr. Moreau is essentially offering to pay Mrs. Blackthorne a premium, to walk away from a property he already controls. Why would he do that? Cordelia demanded. What's he really after? Webb pulled out another document, this one bearing my father's corporate letterhead. The proposal includes a letter explaining Mr. Moreau's motivations. Would you like me to read it? When no one objected, Webb cleared his throat and began. Miss Blackthorne, last night you made a serious error in judgment. You publicly humiliated my daughter and stole property that belonged to her grandmother, a woman who meant more to our family than you could possibly understand. You did this because you believed your social position gave you the right to treat my daughter as lesser than yourself. You were wrong about many things, but your fundamental error was in assuming that quiet people are weak people, and that modest people are powerless people. My mother, Elena Moreau, taught me that true wealth is demonstrated through generosity and discretion, not through displays of dominance over those you perceive as vulnerable. You have now learned that your assumptions about power dynamics in this community were incorrect. The question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge? I am offering you a choice. You can accept this generous buyout offer, relocate to somewhere more suited to your actual financial circumstances, and never again have any contact with my daughter beyond what basic family courtesy requires. In exchange, I will ensure that your departure from Bellhaven is handled with dignity and that your reputation suffers no lasting damage. Alternatively, you can refuse this offer and attempt to maintain your current position. In that case, you will discover exactly how much pressure a determined adversary with unlimited resources can apply to someone whose entire life is built on financial leverage and social positioning that no longer exist. You have 48 hours to decide. The choice is yours, but I recommend you choose wisely. The letter was signed simply Vincent Moreau in bold, confident handwriting. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Cordelia sat frozen, staring at the document, as if it might spontaneously combust. Marcus looked between his mother and me like he was watching a tennis match he couldn't follow. "This is blackmail," Cordelia finally whispered. "No," Webb corrected gently. "This is a business proposal with clearly stated alternatives. Moreau is offering to purchase your property at above market value. You're free to decline. But if I decline, he'll destroy me. Mrs. Blackthorne, he already owns the building you live in and holds the mortgage on your personal residence. If he wanted to destroy you, he wouldn't need to offer you millions of dollars to leave voluntarily." I realized Webb was right. My father wasn't trying to destroy Cordelia. He was giving her a dignified exit from a situation she'd created through her own poor judgment. The alternative he was offering wasn't destruction, it was consequences. "What about my necklace?" I asked quietly. Webb pulled out a small velvet jewelry box from his desk drawer. "Mrs. Blackthorne Sr. asked me to return this to you with her. Apologies for the misunderstanding." I opened the box to find Grandmama Elena's diamond necklace, exactly as I remembered it. The relief was overwhelming, though I tried not to show it. "Where will I go?" Cordelia asked. And for the first time she sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than calculating. "Bellhaven has been my home for 40 years. That's not really my concern," I said, and the words came out colder than I'd intended. "You should have thought about that before you decided to steal from me." Marcus reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Bella, please. She's family." "No, Marcus. She made it very clear last night that I'm not family. I'm just someone she tolerates because you married me. Well, now she knows what happens when you treat the wrong person that way." I stood up, clutching the jewelry box. 48 hours, Mrs. Blackthorne. I suggest you use them wisely." As I walked toward the door, I heard Cordelia call after me. "Isabella, wait. We need to discuss this. We need to find a solution that works for everyone." I turned back one final time. "You had 40 years to find a solution that worked for everyone. Instead, you chose to play power games with people you didn't understand. Now you get to live with the consequences." The look on her face, shock, fear, and something that might have been respect, told me that she was finally beginning to understand who she'd really been dealing with all these years. It was about time. The drive home from Webb's office was tense and silent. Marcus gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw working like he was chewing through a dozen different arguments before discarding each one. I sat in the passenger seat, turning Grandmama Elena's jewelry box over in my hands, feeling the weight of both the recovered necklace and the choice I was about to make. We were 3 blocks from our apartment when Marcus finally exploded. $2.8 million, Bella. Do you understand what that means? That's enough money to set my mother up for life, to ensure she never has to worry about anything ever again, and your father is offering it as a bribe to make her disappear from our lives." "It's not a bribe," I said quietly. "It's consequences." "There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your family is using their money to destroy mine." Marcus pulled into our parking lot with more force than necessary. "How long have you known about your father's wealth, about his properties in Bellhaven, about any of this?" The accusation in his voice cut deep, but I forced myself to remain calm. I knew my father was successful. I didn't know the extent of his investments here, or that he'd been protecting me all these years. "Protecting you?" Marcus turned off the engine and swiveled to face me. "Is that what you call this? He's been manipulating our entire community, positioning himself to control our lives, and you think that's protection?" I met his gaze steadily. "Your mother stole my grandmother's necklace in front of 50 people, Marcus. She humiliated me deliberately and publicly. What did you think was going to happen? That I'd just accept it and move on?" I thought you'd give me a chance to fix it. I thought you'd trust me to handle my own family. The words hung between us, revealing the fundamental disconnect that had been growing for months. Marcus still saw this as a family squabble that could be resolved through diplomacy and compromise. He didn't understand that some violations couldn't be smoothed over with polite conversation. "You've had 3 years to handle your family," I said, climbing out of the car. 3 years of watching your mother treat me like I wasn't good enough to breathe the same air, and every single time, you chose peace over protection. Marcus followed me up the stairs to our apartment, his voice rising with frustration. "So this is your solution? Nuclear warfare? Destroying my mother's entire life because she made a mistake at a party?" I stopped outside our door, key in hand, and turned to face him. "She didn't make a mistake, Marcus. She made a choice, a calculated, deliberate choice to put me in my place, and now she's facing the consequences of that choice. But 48 hours, that's not enough time to process something this huge, to make rational decisions about the future." I opened the door and walked into our living room, setting the jewelry box carefully on the coffee table. "How much time did your mother give me to process being humiliated and robbed? How much consideration did she show for my feelings or my family when she decided to steal something irreplaceable?" Marcus closed the door behind us, but remained standing, as if sitting down would somehow commit him to a conversation he wasn't ready to have. "Bella, I know Mother was wrong. I know what she did was terrible, but this response, it's so extreme, so calculated, it doesn't feel like the woman I married." The observation stung because it contained a grain of truth. The woman Marcus had married wouldn't have been capable of orchestrating something like this, wouldn't have had access to the kind of power my father wielded. But that woman had also been naive about the real nature of the people around her. "Maybe you never really knew the woman you married," I said. "Maybe I never really knew her either, until last night." I moved to the window overlooking Bellhaven's downtown, where normal people were going about their normal lives, unaware that the social order of their community was being quietly restructured by forces they couldn't see. "My father didn't just wake up this morning and decide to buy your mother's building, Marcus. He's been watching, planning, positioning himself for years, and do you know why?" Marcus didn't answer, but I could see him listening intently. "Because he recognized something about your mother that I was too naive to see. He saw that she was the kind of person who would eventually go too far, who would eventually cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and when that happened, he wanted to be ready." I turned back to face my husband, this man I loved but was beginning to understand. I'd never really known. "Your mother has been playing games with people's emotions and social standing for years, Marcus, making people feel small so she could feel big, using her perceived position to hurt people who couldn't fight back. My father just made sure that when she finally targeted the wrong person, there would be consequences." "But why didn't you tell me about your family's money, about your father's capabilities? We're married, Bella. We're supposed to share these things." The question revealed so much about Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. "Because it shouldn't have mattered. Because I thought your love for me, your commitment to our marriage, would be enough to protect me from your mother's cruelty. I shouldn't have needed my father's money to earn basic respect in my own family." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. "So what happens now? Do we just let your father destroy everything my family has built?" "Your family built their position on exclusion and cruelty, Marcus, on making other people feel lesser so they could feel superior. If that gets destroyed, maybe it needed to be destroyed. That's easy to say when your family comes out on top." The bitterness in his voice was new, and it revealed something that had probably been lurking beneath the surface of our relationship for years. Marcus had always taken a certain pride in believing he'd married down, that his family's social position elevated me by association. Learning that the power dynamics were actually reversed was clearly devastating to his sense of identity. "This isn't about coming out on top," I said. "This is about justice. Your mother stole from me, publicly humiliated me, and violated something sacred. She's facing consequences for those actions. If you can't understand the difference between justice and revenge, then maybe we have bigger problems than I thought. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed my father's name, and I realized this conversation with Marcus was about to become much more complicated. I need to take this, I said, answering the call. Isabella. Dad's voice was warm but businesslike. I trust you've recovered your grandmother's necklace. Yes, thank you. Good. Now we need to discuss the next phase. Marcus was watching me intently, clearly trying to piece together my father's words from my responses. What next phase? Cordelia has 48 hours to make her decision, but we need to prepare for both possibilities. If she accepts the buyout offer, we'll need to ensure the transition is handled smoothly. If she refuses, Dad paused. Well, let's just say we have contingency plans for that scenario as well. Dad, I need to ask you something directly. Of course. How long have you been planning for something like this? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Dad finally answered, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Since the first time you called me, crying about something Cordelia had done to you. Since I realized that my daughter was being systematically, emotionally abused by someone who thought their social position made them untouchable. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of Cordelia's behavior as abuse, just as difficult family dynamics, but hearing it described in those terms, I realized Dad was right. Every slight, every deliberate exclusion, every calculated humiliation, I've been documenting it all, sweetheart. Building a case, positioning myself to respond when the inevitable finally happened. The inevitable? People like Cordelia Blackthorne always eventually go too far. Always, they mistake other people's restraint for weakness, and they keep pushing until they push the wrong person. Dad's voice hardened. Last night she pushed my daughter. That was her mistake. Marcus was staring at me now, clearly piecing together enough of the conversation to understand its implications. I need to know something, Isabella, Dad continued. Are you committed to seeing this through? Because once we cross certain lines, there's no going back. Cordelia will never be able to treat you the same way again, but your marriage may not survive the process. I looked at Marcus, this man I'd loved and built a life with, who was now looking at me like I was a stranger. The choice Dad was offering wasn't just about Cordelia, it was about what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of life I wanted to live. I'm committed, I said quietly. Good, then let's finish this properly. After Dad hung up, Marcus and I stared at each other across our living room, both of us understanding that something fundamental had just shifted in our relationship. The woman he'd married, the accommodating, diplomatic nurse who'd spent 3 years trying to win his mother's approval, was gone. In her place stood someone who had access to real power and wasn't afraid to use it. Who are you? Marcus asked finally. I'm Vincent Moreau's daughter, I said. And it's time everyone in this family understood what that really means. The next 24 hours passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Marcus went to work at the bank, maintaining his routine with mechanical precision, while I took another sick day to process everything that had transpired. We moved around each other in our apartment, like polite strangers, each lost in our own thoughts about what the future might hold. I spent the morning researching my father's business empire online, discovering the true scope of what Vincent Moreau had built. Moreau Development Corporation wasn't just successful, it was a multi-state operation, with holdings in commercial real estate, residential developments, and strategic urban planning projects that had reshaped entire communities. News articles described my father as a visionary developer and quiet powerhouse, who preferred to let his results speak for themselves. How had I lived 28 years without truly understanding who my father was? By afternoon I couldn't stand the isolation any longer. I called my best friend Sarah, who worked as a physical therapist at the same hospital where I was a nurse. Sarah had been my confidant through every major life event, including my rocky relationship with Cordelia, but I'd never shared the full extent of the family dynamic. Girl, you sound terrible, Sarah said when she answered. Are you actually sick, or is this about Cordelia again? It's about Cordelia, I admitted, but it's bigger than anything that's happened before. I told her everything, the party, the necklace theft, my father's intervention, and the current 48-hour ultimatum. Sarah listened without interrupting, though I could hear her sharp intake of breath when I described the scope of my father's real estate holding. Isabella Moreau, she said when I finished, are you telling me that your father, your quiet, modest father who sends you birthday cards with $20 bills inside, is actually some kind of real estate mogul? Apparently, and he's been secretly buying up half of Bellhaven because his daughter lives here. That's what it looks like. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You know what this reminds me of? That time in high school when Jenny Hartwell kept bullying you about your second-hand clothes, and then your dad quietly arranged for you to get that full scholarship to college that no one else even knew existed. The memory hit me like a revelation. I'd always assumed that scholarship had been based purely on merit, but now I wondered if Dad had been pulling strings behind the scenes even then, protecting me in ways I'd never recognized. He's always been like this, hasn't he? I said slowly, watching out for me without making a big show of it. The difference is that now you're old enough to see it happening, and apparently Cordelia picked the wrong fight. After talking with Sarah, I felt clearer about my own position, but no less uncertain about my merit. Marcus returned home that evening, looking haggard and defeated, carrying takeout from our favorite Chinese restaurant, an obvious peace offering. We need to talk, he said, setting the food on our kitchen table. I joined him, though my appetite had largely disappeared over the past 2 days. About what? About us. About what happens after tomorrow, regardless of what my mother decides. Marcus served lo mein and orange chicken with careful precision, his banker's need for order asserting itself even in crisis. I talked to my supervisor today, confidentially, about the potential implications of this situation for my position at the bank. This was unexpected. What kind of implications? Think about it, Bella. If your father controls as much real estate in this community as it seems, if he has the kind of financial resources Margaret Chen suggested, then Bellhaven First National is essentially dealing with one of the region's most significant commercial clients, a client who happens to be my father-in-law. The ethical complications hadn't occurred to me, but they were serious. Conflict of interest. Massive conflict of interest. I can't be involved in any commercial lending decisions that might affect your father's property. I can't have access to confidential information about his business relationships. I probably can't even continue in my current position, if there's any possibility of divided loyalties. Marcus set down his chopsticks and looked directly at me. Your father's intervention on your behalf might cost me my career. The weight of unintended consequences was staggering. I'd been so focused on justice for Cordelia's theft that I hadn't considered how dramatically the revelation of my family's true position might affect every aspect of our lives. I'm sorry, I said, though the words felt inadequate. I never wanted your job to be affected by this. I know you didn't, but that doesn't change the reality. Marcus pushed food around his plate without eating. The question is, what do we do about it? Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Hamilton Webb's office number. Mrs. Blackthorne. Webb's voice was tense when I answered. I need to speak with you and your husband immediately. There's been a development. What kind of development? Mrs. Blackthorne Sr. has made her decision. She's rejecting your father's offer. The words sent a chill through me. She's refusing the buyout. More than that, she's retained additional legal counsel and is preparing to fight. She believes she can challenge your father's property acquisitions, claim some kind of manipulation or coercion. Marcus was watching my face, clearly reading the implications in my expression. Can she do that? I asked. She can try. It will be expensive, time-consuming, and almost certainly unsuccessful, but she can try. However, that's not why I'm calling. Webb paused and I could hear papers rustling in the background. I'm calling because she's also threatened to go public with the entire situation. She's contacted Melissa Rivers at the Bellhaven Herald, claims she's going to expose what she calls a systematic campaign of financial manipulation by your father. The Bellhaven Herald was the local weekly newspaper, hardly a major media outlet, but in a community like ours, a front-page story could be devastating for everyone involved. She wants to make this a public scandal, I said, more to myself than to Webb. Apparently, she seems to believe that public pressure will force your father to back down, or at least negotiate from a weaker position. After hanging up, I relayed the conversation to Marcus, who listened with growing alarm. She's going nuclear. Mother always said that if you can't win through proper channels, you change the game entirely. What does that mean for us? Marcus stood up and began pacing around our small kitchen. It means this stops being a private family matter and becomes a public spectacle. It means everyone in Bellhaven will know about your family's wealth, about the real power dynamics in this community. It means, he stopped pacing and turned to face me, it means there's no going back to the way things were. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Heard about Cordelia's decision. Time for phase 2. Meet me at the Grandview Hotel tomorrow at 9 a.m. Come alone. I showed the message to Marcus, who read it with an expression of growing dread. Phase 2? He asked. Before I could respond, another text arrived. This one from an unknown number. This is Melissa Rivers from the Herald. I'd like to speak with you about allegations involving your family and real estate manipulation in Bellhaven. Please call me at your earliest convenience. The journalist was already reaching out, which meant Cordelia was moving fast to control the narrative. She really did it, Marcus said, staring at the phone. She actually went to the press. A third message appeared, this one from Margaret Chen. Client has escalated situation beyond original parameters. Recommend immediate strategic meeting to coordinate response. Legal and PR implications significant. The careful, controlled dismantling of Cordelia's position was about to become something much larger and more unpredictable. Instead of a private lesson in consequences, we were heading toward a public battle that would expose everyone involved. I need to see my father tomorrow, I told Marcus. I need to understand what phase 2 looks like. And I need to figure out how to protect what's left of my career while my family declares war on yours, Marcus replied. We sat in our kitchen, surrounded by untouched Chinese food, both of us understanding that the relatively simple story of justice for a stolen necklace had just become something much more complex and potentially destructive. Cordelia had made her choice. She'd decided to fight rather than accept graceful defeat. Now we were all going to discover what Vincent Moreau looked like when he stopped trying to be generous. The real war was about to begin. The Grandview Hotel sat perched on a hillside overlooking Bellhaven, a 5-star establishment that catered to wealthy tourists and business travelers who preferred discretion to ostentation. I'd driven past it countless times, but never imagined I'd have reason to enter its marble-clad lobby, much less meet my father there for what could only be described as a war council. Dad was waiting in the hotel's private dining room, a space that could be reserved for confidential business meetings away from curious eyes. He wasn't alone. Margaret Chen sat to his right, her laptop open and several thick folders arranged in front of her. Across from them sat a man I didn't recognize, late 40s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he was accustomed to handling serious problems. Isabella, Dad stood as I entered, pulling out a chair for me. Thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet David Hartwell from Crisis Communications Partners. David specializes in managing complex public relations situations. Hartwell rose to shake my hand, his grip firm and assessing. Miss Moreau, I've been briefed on the situation. Quite a family you've married into. The comment could have been sympathetic or sarcastic. His tone was too professional to tell. Before we begin, Dad said once we were all seated, I need you to understand what we're facing. Cordelia's decision to involve the media changes everything. This is no longer about teaching one woman a lesson about consequences. It's about protecting our family's reputation and business interests from a coordinated attack. Margaret opened one of her folders. Melissa Rivers published her first article this morning. The Herald's website posted it at 6 a.m. She slid a printed copy across the table. The headline read, Local Family Claims Real Estate Manipulation by Outside Developer. The article was brief but damaging, painting my father as a shadowy figure who'd systematically acquired properties to control local families, with Cordelia positioned as a victim of financial intimidation. It's mostly innuendo and speculation, Margaret noted. Rivers clearly doesn't have access to the actual financial documents, but the implications are serious. Hartwell leaned forward. The problem isn't what's in this article, it's what comes next. Cordelia has created a narrative where she's the David fighting your Goliath. If we don't respond strategically, that story will gain momentum. What kind of response are you recommending? I asked. Dad's expression was grimmer than I'd ever seen it. Complete transparency. We're going to expose every detail of Cordelia's financial situation, every loan she couldn't repay, every social manipulation she's orchestrated over the years. We're going to show the community exactly who they've been dealing with. The scope of what he was proposing was breathtaking. You're talking about destroying her completely. I'm talking about revealing the truth, Dad corrected. Cordelia chose to make this public. She chose to attack our family's reputation and business integrity. She's forced us into a position where half measures are no longer sufficient. Margaret pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker. We've been conducting a comprehensive investigation into Mrs. Blackthorne's financial history. The picture that emerges is she spread documents across the table: bank statements, loan applications, credit reports, social media posts, and what appeared to be transcripts of phone conversations. Over the past 5 years, Cordelia has borrowed against every asset she owned. The Rosewood Manor mortgage was just the beginning. She's taken personal loans, maxed out credit lines, and borrowed money from several prominent Bellhaven families under false pretenses. I studied the documents with growing shock. She owes money to other families in substantial amounts. The Weatherbys, the Ashfords, the Cunninghams, all people she socializes with regularly, all people she convinced to lend her money for various investment opportunities that never materialized. Hartwell pointed to a series of highlighted entries. She told the Weatherbys she needed $50,000 for a real estate investment in Napa Valley. She told the Ashfords she was buying into an exclusive art gallery in San Francisco. She told the Cunninghams she had an opportunity to purchase rare jewelry at a estate sale. None of which were true, Margaret added. The money went to maintaining her lifestyle: designer clothes, expensive dinners, luxury travel. She's been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme within her own social circle. The revelation was staggering. Cordelia hadn't just been living beyond her means. She'd been systematically defrauding her friends to maintain the illusion of wealth. How much does she owe altogether? Approximately $400,000 in private loans, plus the building mortgage and various credit obligations. Margaret replied, her total debt exceeds her assets by roughly $600,000. Dad leaned back in his chair. Cordelia Blackthorne isn't old money protecting itself from new money intrusion. She's a con artist whose scheme was about to collapse anyway. My intervention just accelerated the timeline. But why target our family specifically? If she was already in financial trouble, why risk making enemies of people with the resources to expose her? Hartwell smiled grimly. Because she thought you were easy targets, a middle-class nurse married to a bank employee, parents who lived modestly and didn't flaunt their wealth. She assumed she could push you around without consequences. Her mistake, Dad said, was confusing discretion with weakness. Margaret pulled out a final set of documents. We've also uncovered some interesting information about her social activity. Did you know that Cordelia has been systematically excluding certain families from community events based on their ethnic backgrounds or perceived social status? This was news to me, though it aligned with the subtle prejudices I'd witnessed over the years. The Patels, who own 3 successful restaurants in town, never invited to charity galas. The Rodriguez, despite Dr. Rodriguez being the hospital's chief of surgery, excluded from the country club's social calendar. The Lynns, whose daughter graduated valedictorian last year, somehow never included in educational fundraising events. Hartwell nodded approvingly. Pattern of discriminatory behavior, financial fraud, theft of personal property. We have multiple angles to work with. What exactly are you planning to do with all this? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the scope of my father's response. Press conference, Dad said simply. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to present a complete picture of who Cordelia Blackthorne really is and what she's been doing to this community for years. But Dad, this will destroy her, completely. There won't be anything left. She made that choice when she decided to steal from my daughter and then attack our family publicly. Dad replied, his voice hard as steel. Cordelia wanted a war, she's going to get one. Margaret began organizing the documents back into their fold. We'll also be announcing the establishment of the Isabella Moreau Community Foundation, a $50 million endowment for local charitable causes. It will be quite clear who the real community benefactors. The contrast was brilliant and devastating. While Cordelia had been stealing from neighbors and excluding minorities, the Moreau family would be revealed as major philanthropists, invested in Bellhaven's future. There's one more thing, Hartwell said, pulling out his phone. We've been monitoring social media and community message boards since yesterday's article. The response to Cordelia's claims has been interesting. He showed me screenshots from various local Facebook groups and neighborhood forums. The comments were revealing. Always wondered how Cordelia afforded that lifestyle on no visible income. She borrowed $5,000 from us last year for a sure thing investment. Haven't seen a penny back. My daughter was excluded from the Junior League scholarship consideration. Now I'm wondering if it was because we're not the right kind of family. Remember when she made those comments about the Martinez family not being suitable for the neighborhood association board? The community was already turning against Cordelia, even before the full truth came out. Her years of social manipulation and financial deception had created enemies she didn't even realize she had. How many people know about tomorrow's press conference? I asked. Every major media outlet in Northern California has been invited, Hartwell replied. This story is about to go far beyond the Bellhaven Herald. The magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. My stolen necklace had triggered a chain of events that would reshape not just my relationship with Cordelia, but the entire social and economic structure of our community. Isabella, Dad said, his voice gentler now. I need you to understand something. After tomorrow, your life will never be the same. People will know who you really are, what your family is capable of. You'll have enemies and allies you never expected. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Marcus, probably sitting in his office at the bank, trying to figure out how to navigate a world where his wife's family wielded unprecedented local influence. I thought about my job at the hospital, my quiet life as a pediatric nurse, the simple existence I'd built for myself. All of that was about to change forever. I'm prepared, I said, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. Good, Dad smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, because tomorrow Cordelia Blackthorne learns what happens when someone declares war on the wrong family. The meeting concluded with final preparations for the press conference, media talking points, and a detailed timeline for the next 48 hours. As I drove back toward town, I realized I was no longer the same person who had attended Cordelia's birthday party 3 days ago. That woman had been naive enough to believe that dignity and courtesy would protect her from cruelty. The woman driving home from the Grandview Hotel understood that sometimes power was the only language certain people could understand. And my family, as it turned out, spoke that language fluently. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Bellhaven Community Center, a neutral venue that could accommodate both local and regional media. I arrived an hour early to find the parking lot already filling with news vans from Sacramento, San Francisco, and even Los Angeles. What had started as a small-town scandal was apparently interesting enough to attract major market attention. Inside, David Hartwell directed the setup with military precision. A podium stood centered on the small stage, flanked by easels holding carefully prepared charts and graphs. Tables along the side walls displayed organized stacks of documents, each marked with colored tabs for easy reference. The presentation would be thorough, methodical, and devastating. Nervous? Margaret Chen asked, appearing beside me as I watched the final preparations. Terrified, I admitted. This morning I was a nurse who worked pediatric shifts and worried about grocery bills. In an hour I'll be the daughter of one of California's most powerful real estate developers, publicly destroying a woman who stole my necklace. The transformation is jarring, Margaret agreed, But remember, you didn't choose this escalation. Cordelia forced this outcome when she decided to take private matters public. At 1:45, my father arrived through a side entrance, avoiding the media gathered in the lobby. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes presentations, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't just business for him, it was personal. "How are you holding up?" he asked, pulling me aside. "I keep thinking about Mark. He's at work right now, probably watching the news trucks drive past his office windows, knowing his wife's family is about to detonate his mother's entire existence." Dad's expression softened. "Isabella, I need you to understand something about marriage. The person you choose to build a life with should be someone who stands with you when the stakes are highest, not someone who makes excuses for people who hurt you." Before I could respond, Hartwell approached with final instructions. "Vincent, we're ready to begin. Isabella, I need you in the front row where cameras can see you, but you won't be speaking unless someone asks a direct question." The media filed in: print journalists, television reporters, bloggers, and what appeared to be several documentary filmmakers. I recognized Melissa Rivers from the Herald, looking significantly less confident than she had when breaking the original story. The scope of coverage had clearly exceeded her expectations. Dad took the podium at exactly 2 p.m., commanding immediate attention despite his modest stature and understated appearance. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. My name is Vincent Moreau, President and CEO of Moreau Development Corporation. I'm here today to address false allegations made against my family and to provide the community with important information about financial fraud and discrimination that has been occurring in Bellhaven for several years." He gestured toward the prepared materials. "Everything I'm about to share with you is documented, verified, and available for your review. We have bank records, loan documents, recorded conversations, and witness testimonials that paint a troubling picture of systematic deception by Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne." The first bombshell was Cordelia's debt situation. Dad methodically presented evidence of her financial fraud, the false investment schemes, the money borrowed under false pretenses, the elaborate web of lies she'd constructed to maintain her lifestyle. Margaret and Hartwell distributed copies of bank statements and loan applications that showed a pattern of deception spanning years. Mrs. Blackthorne has borrowed approximately $400,000 from friends and neighbors under fraudulent pretenses. Dad explained. Money that was supposed to fund non-existent business opportunities was instead used to maintain an illusion of wealth and social status. The second revelation focused on Cordelia's discriminatory behavior. Dad presented documented evidence of her systematic exclusion of minority families from community events, her manipulation of charitable organizations to limit participation by people she deemed unsuitable, and her use of social pressure to maintain artificial barriers within Bellhaven's community structure. The Patel family, who employ 37 people at their restaurants, have been deliberately excluded from Chamber of Commerce events. Dr. Grigas, our hospital's chief of surgery, was blackballed from country club membership despite meeting all qualifications. The Lynn family, whose daughter earned a full scholarship to Stanford, were somehow overlooked for educational fundraising committee. But the most damaging revelation came when Dad addressed Cordelia's theft of my necklace and her subsequent media manipulation. 3 days ago, Mrs. Blackthorne publicly stole a family heirloom from my daughter at her own birthday party. When confronted with legal consequences for this theft, she chose to attack my family through false media accusations, rather than accept responsibility for her actions. Dad pulled out a recording device and placed it beside the microphone. "This is a conversation Miss Blackthorne had with her attorney yesterday, discussing her strategy for dealing with our family." Cordelia's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "I don't care what kind of documentation they have. The important thing is controlling the narrative. If we can make Vincent Moreau look like a bully using his money to intimidate a helpless widow, public sympathy will be on our side. These people think they can come into our community and push us around because they have money. Well, I'll show them what real social power looks like." The recording continued for several minutes, with Cordelia discussing plans to fabricate additional accusations against my father, coordinate negative media coverage, and rally other old families to resist what she called the Moreau invasion. The room erupted with questions from reporters, but Dad held up his hand for silence. "There's one final matter to address," he said. "Mrs. Blackthorne has suggested that my business activities in Bellhaven represent some kind of manipulation or hostile takeover. Let me clarify our actual intentions." He gestured toward a new set of charts showing development plans, employment figures, and economic impact studies. Moreau Development Corporation has invested $68 million in Bellhaven properties over the past 6 years. These investments have created 412 permanent jobs, increased property values by an average of 37%, and generated over $12 million in local tax revenue. The numbers were staggering, revealing the true scope of my father's impact on the community's economic development. Today I'm announcing the establishment of the Elena Moreau Community Foundation, named for my late mother, with an initial endowment of $50 million. This foundation will provide scholarships for underprivileged students, support local small businesses, and fund community development projects chosen by Bellhaven residents themselves. He paused to let the magnitude of this commitment sink in. Additionally, we're launching a whistleblower program for victims of financial fraud within our community. Anyone who has been deceived or stolen from will have access to legal resources to recover their losses and seek appropriate justice. The press conference concluded with a barrage of questions, most directed at understanding how such an extensive pattern of fraud could have operated undetected for so long. Dad fielded each inquiry with factual precision, never expressing personal animosity toward Cordelia but allowing the documented evidence to speak for itself. As the media began filing out, I noticed several community members who had attended despite the official focus on press. The expressions on their faces told the story: shock, anger, and in some cases, recognition that they had been victims of Cordelia's manipulations. Mrs. Patel approached me during the dispersal. "Isabella, I had no idea about your family's circumstance, but I want you to know that your father's announcement about supporting local businesses, that means everything to families like ours." Dr. Rodriguez stopped to shake my father's hand. "Mr. Moreau, my wife and I have felt excluded from this community for years. We thought it was just social dynamics we didn't understand. Knowing it was deliberate, well, it's validating in a painful way." As we gathered our materials, Hartwell provided a preliminary assessment of media response. "Initial coverage is overwhelmingly sympathetic to your position. The recording was particularly effective. It's difficult to maintain victim status when you're caught strategizing about media manipulation." Margaret added her own observations. "3 of Ms. Blackthorne's alleged victims have already contacted our office requesting assistance in recovering their losses. The whistleblower program is going to be very busy." Dad surveyed the emptying room with satisfaction. "Phase 2 is complete. Now we wait to see how Cordelia responds to having her entire foundation of lies exposed to public scrutiny." My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, watching coverage at the bank. "We need to talk when you get home." The tone was impossible to read, but I suspected this conversation would determine the future of our marriage. As we left the community center, I caught sight of Cordelia's Mercedes parked across the street. She sat behind the wheel motionless, apparently having watched the entire press conference from a distance. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the defeat in her posture. The war was over. The question now was whether anyone in the Blackthorne family would survive the aftermath. I found Marcus waiting in our living room when I returned home, still wearing his work clothes but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. The television was on, muted, showing footage from the press conference on the local evening news. My father's image filled the screen as he presented the financial documents that had devastated Cordelia's credibility. "Sit down," Marcus said without looking at me. His voice was carefully controlled, the tone he used when discussing difficult loan applications with clients at the bank. I took the chair across from him, noting the formal distance he'd created between us. This wasn't going to be a conversation between husband and wife, it was going to be a negotiation between adversaries. "I watched the entire press conference online," he began, finally meeting my eye. $50 million, Bella. Your father just announced a $50 million foundation like it was pocket change. The foundation is a good thing, Marcus. It'll help families in this community. Don't," his voice sharpened, "don't pretend this is about community service. Your father just demonstrated to everyone in Bellhaven that he has more money than they could imagine. He didn't create a foundation, he bought a town." The accusation stung because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Dad's announcement had been strategically brilliant, positioning our family as benefactors while highlighting the contrast with Cordelia's fraudulent behavior, but the underlying message was unmistakable. The Moreau family now controlled Bellhaven's economic future. "He exposed the truth about your mother," I said. "Everything he revealed was documented and verifiable." "I'm not defending my mother." Marcus stood and began pacing, a habit he'd developed during stressful situations. "What she did was wrong. Stealing your necklace, lying to her friends, all of it. But your father's response wasn't about justice, Bella. It was about total annihilation." I watched him move around our small living room, this space that had felt like home for 3 years but now seemed foreign and temporary. "What did you expect? That we'd just let her attack our family publicly without responding? I expected proportionality. I expected the woman I married to show some mercy when her opponent was already defeated." The words hit harder than I'd anticipated. "Mercy, Marcus. Your mother spent 3 years making me feel worthless in my own family. She stole something irreplaceable from me and then tried to destroy my father's reputation to cover her own crimes. Where was mercy in any of that?" Marcus stopped pacing and faced me directly. "So this is who you really are. When the chips are down, when you have the power to destroy someone completely, you don't hesitate. This is who I am when someone threatens my family." "Yes, and what about your other family? What about me? What about the fact that your father's little demonstration this afternoon probably ended my career?" The conversation I'd been dreading had finally arrived. "What do you mean?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages from his supervisor at the bank. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Potential conflict of interest review. Possible reassignment. Pending investigation into family connections with major local property owner." The implications were exactly what Marcus had feared. His position at Bellhaven First National was now untenable. He couldn't remain in commercial lending when his father-in-law controlled a significant portion of the local real estate market. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "We'll figure something out. Dad could help you find another position, maybe with a bank in Sacramento. Or, no." Marcus's response was immediate and emphatic. "I will not take charity from your father. I will not become another person in this town who owes their livelihood to Vincent Moreau's generosity." I stared at him, finally understanding the real source of his anger. This wasn't just about his mother or his job. It was about his identity as a man who'd built his own life through his own effort. My father's intervention had reduced Marcus to a dependent, someone whose future depended on the goodwill of his wife's family. "So what are you saying?" Marcus sat back down, but this time he leaned forward, his hands clasped together in the posture he adopted when making difficult decisions. "I'm saying I can't live like this. I can't be married to someone whose family has this kind of power and uses it this way." The words landed like physical blows. "You're talking about divorce. I'm talking about incompatible worldviews. Belle, your family believes that having money gives you the right to reshape other people's lives according to your preferences. My family, despite all its flaws, believes in earning your position through work and community involvement. Your family believes in maintaining power through exclusion and manipulation." I countered. "At least my family's money comes with accountability and transparency, does it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your father spent years secretly positioning himself to control this entire community. That's not transparency, that's strategic patience." Marcus's assessment was uncomfortable in its accuracy. Dad had indeed been playing a longer game than anyone realized, quietly acquiring the infrastructure necessary to reshape Bellhaven's social and economic order when the time came. "He was protecting me," I said, though the justification sounded weak even to my own ear. "He was positioning himself to win a war he knew was coming. There's a difference." We sat in silence for several minutes,
both of us processing the implications of our conversation. The television continued showing footage from the press conference, images of my father methodically destroying Cordelia's credibility while positioning himself as Bellhaven's new patriarch. The irony, Marcus said finally, is that I actually agree with most of what your father did today. Mother needed to face consequences for her behavior. The community needed to know about her financial fraud and discrimination, but the way he did it, the overwhelming force, the public humiliation, the demonstration of absolute power, that's what I can't accept. So, you'd rather she got away with it? I'd rather the punishment fit the crime. Your grandmother's necklace was worth $40,000. Your father just spent $50 million to prove a point about proportionate response. The mathematical irony was inescapable. Dad's foundation announcement alone was worth more than 1,000 times the value of the stolen necklace. What do you want me to do, Marcus? Pretend this never happened? Go back to letting your mother treat me like I'm beneath her? I want you to acknowledge that your family went too far. I want you to recognize that there were other ways to handle this situation, that didn't involve destroying every aspect of my mother's life.
But that recognition wouldn't come. Sitting in our living room watching the news coverage of Cordelia's exposure, I felt no regret about the scope of my father's response. The woman who had humiliated me 3 days ago was the same woman who had been systematically stealing from her friends and excluding minorities from community life. She had made calculated choices about how to treat other people, and now she was experiencing the consequences of those choices. I can't give you what you want, I said quietly. Marcus nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Then we have a problem. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from my father. The timing couldn't have been worse, but I answered anyway. Isabella? I wanted to give you an update on the immediate aftermath, Dad said without preamble. Cordelia's attorney called Margaret an hour ago. She's prepared to accept a modified settlement offer, complete restitution to her fraud victims, immediate departure from Bellhaven, and a signed agreement never to contact you or make public statements about our family. What about criminal charges for the fraud? We're recommending that local authorities pursue prosecution, but that's beyond our direct control. The point is, she's accepted defeat. The war is over. Marcus was watching me intently, clearly following my side of the conversation. Dad, I need to ask you something directly. Was all this really necessary? The press conference, the foundation announcement, the complete destruction of her reputation. The pause was long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Dad finally responded, his voice carried a gravity I'd rarely heard. Isabella? Some people only understand force. Your mother-in-law spent years using her perceived social position to hurt people who couldn't fight. She stole from you because she believed you were powerless to respond. The only way to ensure she never targets our family again was to demonstrate exactly how powerless she actually is. After ending the call, I found Marcus staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He's right, isn't he? Marcus said finally. About Mother, about the kind of person she really is. I've spent 3 years making excuses for behavior I knew was wrong, because I wanted to believe family loyalty mattered more than individual accountability. Does that change anything? Marcus was quiet for a long time, considering his answer. It changes everything, and nothing. It means I can't defend her anymore. But it also means I can't pretend your family's response was about justice rather than dominance. He stood up and moved toward the bedroom. I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight. We both need time to think about whether this marriage can survive what we've learned about each other. As he packed a small overnight bag, I realized that winning the war against Cordelia might have cost me something equally valuable. The victory was complete, but the price was higher than I'd anticipated. After Marcus left, I sat alone in our apartment, wearing my grandmother's recovered necklace, surrounded by the life we'd built together, but no longer sure if any of it would survive the revelation of who we really were underneath our carefully constructed identities. The war was over. Now came the harder question of whether anyone would survive the peace. 6 months after Cordelia's departure from Bellhaven, I stood in the children's wing of the newly renovated Riverside General Hospital, watching contractors install the final pieces of equipment in what would become the Isabella Moreau Pediatric Care Center. The gleaming facility bore my grandmother's name, funded by the foundation Dad had established during that pivotal press conference, but it felt strange to see our family legacy displayed so prominently after years of quiet anonymity. "The new MRI machine arrives next week," Patricia Williams said, joining me in the observation area. As the hospital's chief administrator, she'd been overseeing the renovation project with characteristic efficiency. "This facility will serve children from 5 counties. Your family's contribution is going to save lives for generations." I nodded, still adjusting to being recognized as a major philanthropist, rather than simply another nurse. The past 6 months had brought changes I was still learning to navigate, some welcome, others more complicated than I'd anticipated. The most immediate change had been my marriage. Marcus had stayed at the hotel for 3 days after our confrontation, calling twice daily to discuss practical matters, but avoiding any substantive conversation about our future. When he finally returned home, he'd carried himself differently, more carefully, as if he wasn't sure what might trigger another explosive revelation about hidden family dynamics. "I've been thinking about what you said," he'd announced that first evening back, "about proportionate response and family loyalty, about choosing between being your husband and my mother's son." I'd waited, not trusting myself to speak without saying something that might push him away permanently. "I can't defend what Mother did," he'd continued. "The theft, the fraud, the discrimination, all of it was wrong and she needed to face consequences. But I also can't pretend that your father's response was solely about justice. It was about power, about demonstrating dominance, about ensuring that no one would ever again mistake restraint for weakness." The assessment had been uncomfortably accurate. "So where does that leave us?" "It leaves us trying to build a marriage based on who we actually are rather than who we thought we were. It leaves me learning to be married to someone whose family operates at a level I never imagined. And it leaves you deciding whether you can love someone who still believes there should be limits on how power is used, even when that power is justified." The conversation had marked the beginning of a slow, careful rebuilding process. Marriage counseling with Dr. Susan Reeves, a therapist recommended by the hospital's employee assistance program. Weekly dinners where we practiced talking about difficult topics without retreating into defensive positions. Gradual reconstruction of intimacy and trust. The process hadn't been smooth. Marcus had indeed lost his position at Bellhaven First National, though he'd found new employment as a commercial loan officer with a regional bank based in Sacramento. The 40-minute commute was manageable, and the position actually paid better than his previous job, but the transition had been a reminder that my family's prominence had consequences for everyone around us. More challenging had been navigating the social dynamics of post-Cordelia Bellhaven. The community had absorbed the revelations about her financial fraud and discriminatory behavior with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and, in some cases, relief. Families who had felt excluded from social events suddenly understood why. People who had lent her money began pursuing legal remedies through the Victim Assistance Program Margaret Chen had established, but the most significant change had been the recognition of my family's true position within the community. Dad's real estate holdings and business connections were no longer secret, and the Isabella Moreau Foundation had made the extent of our resources undeniably public. I could no longer pass as just another middle-class working professional. People knew exactly who I was and what my family was capable of. The recognition brought both opportunities and burden. The hospital had offered me a promotion to nursing supervisor, acknowledging both my clinical skills and my family's support for healthcare initiatives. The Bellhaven School District had invited me to join their board of directors. 3 different charitable organizations had requested my participation in fundraising efforts, but the attention also meant constant awareness that my actions reflected not just on myself but on my family's reputation and the foundation's mission. Every decision carried weight beyond its immediate impact. "Isabella?" Dr. Williams's voice brought me back to the present. "You seemed lost in thought." "Just processing how much has changed," I replied honestly. Through the window, I could see the construction crew working on the foundation's next project, a community center that would provide after-school programs and small business development resources in the historically underserved eastern part of town. The same area where many of the families Cordelia had systematically excluded actually lived. "Has there been any word from Mrs. Blackthorne?" Dr. Williams asked. The question was carefully neutral, but I knew she was curious about the aftermath of Bellhaven's most dramatic scandal in decades. She's living in Arizona now. Phoenix, I think. She sold her remaining property to pay restitution to the people she defrauded, and the foundation provided additional funds to ensure everyone was made whole. I didn't mention that Dad had also arranged for Cordelia to receive a modest monthly stipend, enough to live comfortably but not enough to rebuild the kind of lifestyle she'd maintained through fraud. It was characteristic of his approach, decisive in eliminating threats, but not unnecessarily cruel in victory. And Marcus? How is he adjusting to everything? It was a question I'd been asking myself regularly. We're learning. Marriage is more complicated when you discover that everything you thought you knew about power dynamics was wrong. Dr. Williams nodded knowingly. I imagine so, though from what I've observed, you two seem committed to figuring it out. That evening, I drove home to the house Marcus and I had purchased in Bellhaven's historic district, a modest Victorian that reflected our combined salaries rather than my family's resource. We'd deliberately chosen to maintain the lifestyle we'd built together, despite my father's repeated offers to help us upgrade to something more appropriate. Marcus was in the kitchen when I arrived, preparing dinner with the methodical attention he brought to all domestic tasks. 6 months of counseling had taught us both to recognize the small gestures that maintained connection during stressful periods. How was the hospital tour? He asked, kissing my cheek in greeting. Productive. The pediatric center should be fully operational by next month. I hung up my jacket and joined him at the counter. Dr. Williams asked about your mother. Marcus's hands paused in their chopping motion. What did you tell her? That she's in Arizona, that the restitution process is complete. I didn't mention the monthly payments your father arranged. We'd learned to navigate these conversations carefully. Marcus appreciated that my family had ensured his mother's basic needs were met, but he remained uncomfortable with the reminder of her dependence on our generosity. I got a letter from her yesterday, he said quietly. This was unexpected. Cordelia had maintained radio silence since leaving Bellhaven, adhering to the agreement that prohibited contact with our family. What did she say? Marcus pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to me. The handwriting was Cordelia's, but it looked smaller and less confident than I remembered. Marcus, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you and I understand if you choose not to respond, but I wanted you to know that I've started seeing a therapist here in Phoenix, someone who specializes in helping people understand how their behavior affects others. It's difficult work confronting the person I became over the years, the entitlement, the cruelty, the assumption that my social position gave me the right to treat people as less than human. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused. I think about Isabella often, and about the necklace I stole from her, not because I needed jewelry, but because I wanted to demonstrate that I had power over her, that she was subject to my whims regardless of how it made her feel. It was evil, and I'm ashamed. Your father-in-law could have destroyed me completely, but he chose mercy alongside justice. The monthly support allows me to live with dignity while facing the consequences of my actions. Please tell him I'm grateful. I hope someday you'll be able to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. You deserved a mother who supported your marriage instead of sabotaging it, who celebrated your happiness instead of resenting it. I love you, even though I failed to show it appropriately. I read the letter twice, trying to process this version of Cordelia, vulnerable, accountable, genuinely remorseful. It was so different from the calculating woman who had stolen my necklace that it felt like correspondence from a stranger. What do you think? Marcus asked. I think she's finally telling the truth, I replied. The question is whether it matters after everything that happened. Marcus took the letter back and folded it carefully. I think it matters for me, not because it changes what she did, but because it suggests she might actually become a different person. We spent dinner discussing whether Marcus should respond to his mother's letter, what kind of relationship might be possible going forward, and how to balance forgiveness with appropriate boundaries. These conversations had become easier over time, as we'd learned to discuss difficult topics without falling into defensive patterns. After dinner I sat on our front porch wearing Grandmama Elena's necklace and watching the evening activity on our quiet street. 6 months ago I'd been a nurse, whose biggest concern was managing difficult family dynamics. Now I was a philanthropist whose decisions affected entire communities, married to a man who was still learning to love someone with access to unprecedented power. The transformation had been necessary but costly. The justice delivered to Cordelia had been proportionate but overwhelming. The victory achieved had been complete but complicated. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss the scholarship program expansion. Your input on selection criteria would be valuable. I smiled, recognizing that these regular consultations were Dad's way of gradually involving me in the foundation's leadership. Eventually, I would need to decide how much of my life I wanted dedicated to managing the family's philanthropic activity. Marcus joined me on the porch carrying 2 cups of tea. Regrets? He asked, settling into the chair beside me. I considered the question carefully. 6 months had provided enough distance for honest assessment. No, I said finally. Cordelia made choices that required consequence. My father delivered those consequences proportionately and with precision. We protected our family and helped other people in the process, even knowing the cost. Some battles are worth fighting, even when victory changes everything. Marcus nodded, reaching for my hand. Then we'll figure out how to live with the changes together. As evening settled over Bellhaven, I reflected on the lesson my grandmother had tried to teach me years ago. Quiet people aren't weak people, and modest people aren't powerless people. Sometimes the strongest response comes from those who prefer peace but are prepared for war. The necklace around my neck had been recovered, but more importantly, the principle it represented, that actions have consequences, that family is worth protecting, that power should be used responsibly, had been upheld. The war was over, the victory was complete, and the future remained ours to build. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.